Imagine flickering fluorescent lights buzzing softly above a cramped, windowless room. A man sits at a steel table, shoulders tense, a blindfold resting just above his brow. In front of him, a single sheet of blank paper and a sharpened pencil. Somewhere behind him, a tape recorder clicks on. A calm voice reads out a string of numbers, just coordinates meaningless on their own. The man exhales, lowers the blindfold, and lets his hand hover over the page. For a moment, nothing happens. Then his pencil begins to move, sketching lines, curves, and shapes tied to a place he has never seen, thousands of miles away. On the other side of a one-way mirror, two observers watch in silence. Their clipboards are half filled with notes, their faces unreadable. They're not here for a seance. They're here on government time. Somewhere down the hall, stacks of manila folders are stamped with strange code names: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Sunstreak. Each one represents another attempt to answer a question that sounds more like science fiction than national security policy. Can the human mind be turned into a weapon? Outside, the world carries on as usual. Wind moves through the oak trees of suburban Virginia. Phones ring in ordinary offices. Cars idle at red lights. No one out there knows that, behind these secure doors, physicists are quietly reading books on Eastern mysticism between briefings, trying to bridge quantum theory and psychic perception. The atmosphere inside is strange. Half laboratory, half occult research center. Computers and printers chatter, classified memos circulate, and somewhere a mid-level analyst is wondering how to file a report that mentions visions and impressions next to satellite imagery and intercepted communications. For more than 2 decades, this is how it went. A handful of people in small rooms, closing their eyes and claiming to see through walls, across oceans, and into enemy bases. This is Project Stargate. The Stargate project didn't begin with mysticism or curiosity. It began with fear. In the late 1960s and early 70s, American intelligence analysts began hearing unsettling reports. The Soviet Union might be investing heavily in psychotronic research. Rumors claimed Soviet scientists were studying telepathy, mind control, and even long-distance perception as potential military tools. In a world where both nations already lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation, this possibility, however strange, couldn't be ignored. So the CIA funded a quiet, exploratory program known as Project Scrutiny. The work soon moved to the Stanford Research Institute in California, where two physicists, Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff, found themselves investigating something no physics textbook had prepared them for: remote viewing. The idea that a person could perceive a distant location using nothing but the mind. Their test subjects weren't spies or soldiers. They were artists, engineers, and people who simply claimed they saw things when given a set of coordinates. Some sessions were incoherent. Others produced sketches that seemed to disturbingly line up with real-world locations. At this stage, the project felt more like an academic oddity wrapped in classified tape than a national security initiative. But within a few years, it would be pulled into the machinery of Cold War intelligence. The question had shifted from, is this real, to, can we use it? By the late 1970s, remote viewing stepped out of the lab and into operational territory. The Army established units under names that disguised their purpose: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane. Behind each title was a small collection of personnel, some soldiers, some civilians, placed in dark rooms and asked to describe missile silos, submarine facilities, and hostage locations. Sometimes the results landed in the uncanny middle ground between coincidence and insight. One remote viewer sketched a Soviet nuclear testing site with surprising accuracy. The layout, the equipment, even a large crane that analysts later confirmed through reconnaissance imagery. Another reportedly helped narrow the search radius for a crashed aircraft in Africa. And then there was Joe McMoneagle, a former Army intelligence officer who would become the program's most accomplished participant. His reports, sketches, and impressions were collected for years, eventually earning him a reputation inside the project as someone who could deliver details no satellite could have known at the time. Whenever a case was especially strange, accurate yet inexplicable, analysts jokingly referred to it as an 8-martini result, because that's how many drinks it took to process what they were seeing. During this period, the project kept changing names and homes. Each shift added new layers of oversight, funding, and expectations. Grill Flame became Center Lane. Center Lane became Sunstreak, and Sunstreak became Stargate. By now, the United States had quietly invested millions of dollars and over a decade of effort. Remote viewers were working full-time. Formal protocols had been established. Sessions were recorded, analyzed, and archived. And even skeptics inside the intelligence community couldn't ignore one fact. Agencies kept requesting remote viewing data. In a system that buries anything useless within months, the project had survived years. Something inside those rooms kept attracting attention. But with time came scrutiny. In the 1980s, outside evaluators began examining the program's methodology and reliability. Their findings were cautious at best, critical at worst. When remote viewing trials were placed under tighter scientific controls, the success rate seemed to drift dangerously close to chance. Despite this, the program persisted, shifting from one agency to another, eventually landing under the Defense Intelligence Agency and later a private contractor. Each transition gave it just enough shelter to continue. But by 1995, political winds had changed, budgets tightened, skeptical voices grew louder, and the CIA commissioned a final review of the program's effectiveness. The verdict? Remote viewing had never been shown to provide consistently actionable intelligence. After more than 20 years, the program was terminated. When the files were eventually released to the public, the reaction was split. Some called it a waste of money. Others were stunned that the government had spent decades investigating psychic perception. Former participants defended their work, insisting critics didn't understand what the raw data truly represented. The official story declared the project interesting but ultimately fruitless, a curious footnote of Cold War paranoia. But as with all stories in the shadows of intelligence work, the official version is only one side of the archive. When the Stargate files were declassified, most people expected a quirky Cold War oddity, an amusing relic from a paranoid era. But as researchers, journalists, and former participants began combing through the documents, a different picture emerged, one filled with strange consistencies, unexplained successes, and decisions that didn't quite align with the official conclusion. Believers argue that these fragments of information, session transcripts, analyst notes, and personal testimonies form a subtle but undeniable pattern. A pattern suggesting the government may have uncovered something real, even if they couldn't fully control it. These are the claims that form the backbone of that argument. Believers begin with the stories that refuse to disappear, the sessions where remote viewers produced descriptions too specific to dismiss, One viewer sketched the layout of a Soviet nuclear facility, capturing structural elements analysts hadn't yet confirmed. Another provided details that helped narrow the search for a downed aircraft in Africa. A third described the construction of a submarine pen long before imagery caught up. There were dozens of sessions like this, not perfect hits, but hits unsettling enough that analysts continued tasking remote viewers for years. Then there's Joe McMoneagle, whose involvement spans over a decade of the project. He would later be recognized for intelligence contributions that, according to believers, cannot be fully explained through conventional means. His sketches and written impressions appear in case after case across the archives. Believers ask a simple question. If the program produced nothing of value, why were successes recorded at all? And why were they taken seriously enough to influence tasking for years? Government projects do not survive 2 decades on coincidence alone. The second claim focuses not on the successes themselves, but on the program's oddly slow death. By the early 1990s, Stargate wasn't shut down. It was moved, transferred out of government buildings and into the hands of a private contractor. To believers, this move is significant. Contractors operate under different rules, different oversight structures, and are far harder to track through Freedom of Information requests. Some argued that the 1995 shutdown was little more than a public closure, a symbolic gesture while the real work continued under deeper classification. They point to strange budget line items, scattered whistleblower accounts, and the simple logic of intelligence work. If even a fraction of remote viewing was functional, it would be too valuable to discard. And if it wasn't functional, why did it persist for so long? Believers insist that official silence is not proof of absence. It's often the first sign of a program moving further underground. The third claim is the most controversial and the most difficult to verify. Some remote viewers reported moments that seemed to go beyond standard reconnaissance. Impressions of non-human intelligences, glimpses of structures not associated with any known location, and encounters that felt less like perceiving a place and more like touching something else entirely. None of this appears in the formal documentation. No analyst ever filed a report titled Contact. But these stories appear in interviews, memoirs, and private recollections, shared long after the program ended. Believers argue that the government's decision to terminate the project publicly may not have been about failure, but about crossing a boundary that intelligence agencies were unprepared to explore. If remote viewing occasionally reached into areas outside human experience, shutting it down, at least on paper, may have been the only acceptable option. To the believers, the evidence doesn't point to a failed experiment. It points to a breakthrough that government agencies could neither openly acknowledge nor comfortably deny. The strange successes, the incomplete explanations, the secrecy layered onto secrecy. Taken together, they suggest that Stargate may not have shown the limits of human perception, but the limits of what the intelligence community was willing to admit. A balanced investigation requires more than intrigue. It requires scrutiny. While the believer narrative draws attention to striking anecdotes and unusual patterns, skeptics argue that the true story of the Stargate project is far less mysterious and far more human. To them, the project was not evidence of secret breakthroughs or buried capabilities. It was an experiment shaped by Cold War fear, inconsistent methodology, and a tendency to highlight the impressive hits while quietly discarding the misses. Skeptics acknowledge that some remote viewing sessions produced results that appeared unusual, but they argue that anecdotes, even compelling ones, cannot substitute for controlled evidence. Across hundreds of trials, the overwhelming majority of sessions produced vague, contradictory, or incorrect information. When strict protocols were applied, blind targets, double-blind judging, forward feedback controls, the accuracy consistently drifted towards statistical noise. In other words, the impressive cases stand out precisely because they were rare. Skeptics also point to a phenomenon common in intelligence analysis: retrofitting. Analysts sometimes matched a viewer's sketch or description to a known target only after the fact, interpreting ambiguous shapes or phrases in ways that seem meaningful once the real site was revealed. Confirmation bias, they argue, did the rest. As for long-term participants like Joe McMoneagle, skeptics do not dismiss his sincerity, only the interpretation of his results. Intelligence work often rewards persistence, loyalty, and willingness to explore unconventional avenues. Awards, from this perspective, reflect service, not proof. Believers suggest the program never truly ended. Skeptics counter with a simpler explanation. If Stargate had value, it wouldn't have been cut. By the early 1990s, defense budgets were tightening, and unconventional programs were expected to justify their existence with measurable results. Stargate did not. The program was moved to a contractor not to hide it, skeptics argue, but to offload a project that internal agencies no longer wanted to manage directly. When the CIA conducted a final review in 1995, the conclusion was direct. Remote viewing had not produced intelligence that could be replicated, relied upon, or acted on with confidence. In intelligence work, reliability is everything. Skeptics also note that modern intelligence collection, drone surveillance, digital interception, satellite imagery, is built around verifiable performance. If remote viewing held even marginal value, they argue, it would have been integrated, not erased. No credible whistleblowers, no leaked budgets, and no operational references have ever surfaced to suggest Stargate continued under a different name. Silence in this case is simply silence. The most fringe claims, encounters with non-human intelligences, glimpses of structures not found on Earth, face the steepest scrutiny. To skeptics, these accounts reflect the psychological nature of remote viewing sessions. Subjects spent years in dim rooms, eyes closed, asked to imagine distant places under conditions that encouraged introspection, suggestion, and creative interpretation. In such a setting, unusual or surreal impressions are not signs of extraterrestrial contact. They are signs of the mind doing what the mind naturally does under sensory restriction. It fills the void. There is no mention of aliens or otherworldly communication in any official report, session transcript, or internal memo. To skeptics, the absence of documentation is not a cover-up. It is evidence that nothing resembling such events occurred within the program's operational framework. The cosmic interpretations, they argue, belong not to Stargate itself, but to the mythology that formed around it after the fact. The skeptic's narrative reframes Stargate not as a doorway to hidden abilities, but as a study in human pattern-seeking, Cold War anxiety, and the difficulty of measuring subjective experiences with objective tools. To them, Stargate is a lesson in scientific discipline. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence simply wasn't there. But between the believer's confidence and the skeptic's certainty lies a space that neither fully answers, a space where the limitations of science, psychology, and intelligence work overlap. That is where the theories begin. When the official story ends and the declassified documents run out, we're left with a space that intelligence agencies rarely acknowledge. The gap between what they discovered, what they could prove, and what they were willing to admit. The Stargate project sits precisely in that gap. Too strange to dismiss entirely, too inconsistent to endorse publicly. Here, we explore not conclusions, but possibilities. Scenarios that ask what the program might have been, or what it might reveal about human perception, national security, and the limits of scientific understanding. These are not claims. They are controlled thought experiments designed to examine the implications of Stargate if certain assumptions were true. Imagine remote viewing truly worked, not flawlessly, not dramatically, but reliably enough to offer consistent advantages. Intelligence agencies are built on margins of error, small percentages that change the outcome of wars. A single accurate sketch or correct impression, repeated hundreds of times, could quietly alter the balance of power. In this scenario, Stargate wasn't an oddity. It was the first step toward a new intelligence frontier: mental reconnaissance. The idea that a trained viewer could perceive a missile base or track a moving target without leaving the room would redefine the meaning of surveillance. But with capability comes consequence. Governments might attempt to recruit or even compel individuals who demonstrate unusual perceptual abilities. Nations would scramble to develop countermeasures, psychological shielding, cognitive noise systems, or ethics frameworks for mental privacy. If thought itself becomes a tool of warfare, the battlefield moves from terrain and airspace into the human mind, a place with no borders, no treaties, and no clear rules. Another theory suggests Stargate's psychic narrative may have served an entirely different purpose. In intelligence work, the best cover stories are the ones no one wants to investigate. A program involving psychic spying fits this requirement neatly, strange enough to raise eyebrows, absurd enough to discourage deep scrutiny. Under this theory, remote viewing wasn't the objective. It was the camouflage. A way to shelter unrelated research, interrogation methods, psychological conditioning, influence operations, or even early cognitive warfare strategies. Resources, personnel, and budgets could quietly shift through a program so unusual that oversight committees would write it off as a fringe experiment. The lack of hard results wouldn't matter, because results weren't the point. If true, Stargate becomes a cautionary tale about how intelligence agencies can hide real initiatives behind strange ones, not because the truth is supernatural, but because it's far more ordinary and far more controversial. A third possibility avoids espionage entirely and focuses on the human mind. Even if remote viewing failed as an intelligence tool, the thousands of recorded sessions might reveal something subtler, patterns in intuition, perception, or subconscious processing that science has yet to fully understand. Perhaps the human brain is more predictive, more sensitive to environmental cues, or more interconnected than we currently assume. Remote viewing could be an accidental doorway into a field of cognitive research that remains largely unexplored. Under this theory, the tragedy of Stargate isn't the failure to produce psychic spies. It's the abandonment of a data set that could have reshaped our understanding of perception itself. Something between intuition and imagination may be waiting to be defined, measured, and studied with tools that didn't exist during the Cold War. The implications reach beyond espionage and into neuroscience, creativity, medicine, and human potential. Not supernatural, just undiscovered. These theories don't claim what Stargate was. They explore what Stargate might mean. Whether the program touched on unusual cognitive phenomena, served as camouflage for unrelated research, or hinted at the outer edge of human perception, one truth remains. Stargate exists in a liminal space between science and speculation, a reminder that the human mind remains our most powerful tool and our most mysterious frontier. The Stargate project exists in a strange corner of history, a place where scientific rigor, Cold War paranoia, and human curiosity collided in ways few people expected and even fewer understood. For more than 2 decades, the United States government quietly explored a question most institutions would never ask publicly. Can the human mind reach beyond the borders of the physical world? The official answer was no. The budget closed, the files were boxed, and the experiment ended. But the unofficial answer, the one found in interviews, transcripts, and the lingering discomfort of the people who worked inside those rooms, is far less conclusive. Believers point to the moments that defy easy explanation, sketches that matched real sights, impressions that aligned with later intelligence, and the program's surprising longevity. Skeptics counter with the clarity of data. They argue that the successful cases were statistical outliers, that methodological weaknesses shape the narrative, and that the human mind is far more prone to pattern making than perception at a distance. And both sides have a point. The truth is that Stargate sits in the narrow space between the measurable and the experiential, a space where intelligence work struggles, where science pauses, and where human perception refuses to fit neatly into charts and probabilities. The project raises questions that outlived its budget. What tools should science use to study the extraordinary? How do intelligence agencies decide what is too strange to investigate and what is too strange to ignore? And if even one session produced a result that cannot be explained, what does that mean for the limits of the mind? Stargate may never offer a clean conclusion. It may always be a puzzle with too many missing pieces, a story caught between skepticism and belief. But perhaps its real legacy is this. It reminds us that the world remains bigger and stranger than the systems we build to understand it. And sometimes, the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that unfold not in distant places, but in the quiet space behind closed eyes. If you found this journey into the unknown intriguing, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Do you believe the human mind can access information beyond the senses? Have you ever experienced something that defied logic or explanation? Share your thoughts below and join us next week as we explore another mystery hiding just beyond the edges of what we're told to believe.